just for openers, I'd like you to, if you would, just repeat this about the difficulties of information, mentioning the 44 different provinces. I mean, if you just make that statement, we can use it. Go ahead.
You ready to go?
Yeah.
We've mentioned the information problem several times. I can recall making many speeches in the United States after I returned as ambassador, trying to explain why these apparently the contradictory views and reports coming out of Vietnam by officials, by the media, by various sources. Why this confusion? Well, there's really a very good reason for it, an inevitable development, I would say, of the situation. Namely, you have 44 provinces in South Vietnam, and they're all different. They're different in climate, in geography, many times in the ethnic background of the people. Some are urban, a few big cities, a great deal of rice land, a great deal of forest. That the result is that there was not just a single war to be reported by officials and by the press. There were really 44 different wars. And you could have an accurate reporter in each one of those provinces and get 44 different reports coming to Washington, and all of them be right in their own way, yet none a complete picture. And then at home then, we committed the human fault. We saw on television, as we did one time, a Marine or soldier burning a peasant's cottage. The feeling was, well, that's what the Army and the Marines are doing, burning down people's houses. And that was a generalization from a single fact. So a combination of those things, the inherent complexity, plus our over-facile generalizations we make for ourselves, created many of the problems which plagued our leadership throughout the entire war.
In February of '64, you and McNamara went back to Vietnam, and then the government in Vietnam was headed by Premier Nguyen Can. And you discussed the possibility, the prospect of selective air and naval attacks against the North with him. First of all, what kind of reaction did he have to that notion?
As I recall, we were just feeling out with this new man who had not been in office very long. What his reaction to that kind of thing would be.
Excuse me, could you mention his name when you do that?
General Khan.
No, start again and mention his name. Could you start again and mention his name?
Well, insofar as our discussion with General Khan is concerned, as I recall, we were rather feeling out a new prime minister whom we knew somewhat as an Army officer, but we wanted to see how we would feel about some of the policy issues were debating ourselves. And one was the perennial question, or the intermittent question of should we not use our Air Force against targets in North Vietnam. So it was just a feeler kind of discussion. We were not committed to either course of action, and he turned out to be very enthusiastic for it, as I expected him to be.
I just want to go back to one question about the coup against Diem, if I may. There's one thing I overlooked. As you look back, do you believe that we played a role, that we were responsible either directly or indirectly in the coup against Diem?
Well, yes, we certainly played a role in the sense of making it public knowledge that we were, if not disowning Diem, that we were considered Diem thoroughly expendable. And the August 24 cable we discussed made it official to the senior generals, and then our action in cutting off or slowing down the flow of various forms of economic aid to Diem. That was a public fact. So insofar as telling the Diem's enemies, of which there were many, that if you go for him and replace him, that's all right with us. Now, that doesn't say whether the quality of the replacement is also a factor in which we have an interest, but it's just really a blank check to move ahead and make a change in government.
Again, in retrospect, do you think that because we got involved in the internal situation there in encouraging his opposition, that this had the effect of deepening our commitment to Vietnam.
Well, anything you do deepens your commitment. I've often reflected on the fact that the American interest in Vietnam, how real was it? Well, it changed from month to month and year to year. The longer we were there, the greater our interest, in the sense we had made a greater stake. We had put more of our prestige on the line, our reputation on the line, so it was a cumulative thing like a snowball. So our interest was constantly increasing, although in terms of physical things you might weigh and evaluate in price, they might stay unchanged. These intangibles were tremendously important. Now that's part of your question. What I missed that.
Well, I was saying that would you, to go back again, the support for the encouragement to Diem's opponents, direct or indirect, the question really was, did it get us deeper and more deeply involved in Vietnam?
Yes, and my answer is yes. For that it did that. Our responsibility for the overthrow and the murder of Diem certainly contributed to our obligation to South Vietnam. When I was ambassador there, I often said it must be Homeric justice I'm sent there, because in some sense I took part in this thing. But I have been asked in the later years that since the conditions were so chaotic, political conditions, I faced 5 different premiers in a year in 13 months. 5 different sets of generals, 5 different sets of province governors. You can just imagine the problem in a country where the leadership is so limited and you don't have fallback talent, that you were simply putting in experienced men to follow experienced men every 2 or 3 months. Well, why in a time like that, Taylor, didn't you recommend we call this thing off? Well, I would say there are several good reasons to me, and I went over this at the time thinking about it. One was that we have not used all our resources. We still have many things that we can do to help the situation, especially the use of our area in North Vietnam. But I think the other part was that the feeling of guilt of having contributed to this chaos by our actions in '63 in encouraging the downfall of Vietnam. That these people were not all responsible for this. We certainly contributed a part of it, and we ought to carry our burden forward. And the third thing was the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which means lots of different things to senators apparently, but to the ambassador in Saigon in August of '64, it said, Taylor, we're on the course of action we're following is vital to the United States. Pull up your socks and do better. You've been trying all right, but try harder. So that's a third reason to say, well, I couldn't possibly then send a cable back. I think the cause is lost.
When you were appointed ambassador in June of 1964, what did President Johnson tell you? I mean, this is really getting at a point that, what did Johnson want in Vietnam?
I wish you'd asked me first, how did you get the job?
All right, let's go back. How did you get the job?
Well, you recall that Cabot Lodge was ambassador, and to the surprise of a lot of people, I think probably to Cabot's surprise, in the Republican presidential in New Hampshire, he came out first. So that there was a great feeling among the Republicans and many people of Cabot's friends, not Republican, that he ought to come back and try this out, run the course. He'd be a fine choice for president. So everyone said, that's fine, get him back. But then having a little like replacing Diem. Now that Cabot's gone, who's going to take his place? Well, there's a great silence. The president asked all of us to recommend people. I put in a name, and other people put in names, but none of the names seemed to satisfy him. And then Dean Rusk announced he was available. He'd be glad to take the job. The president thanked him, and McNamara said, I'd be glad to volunteer also. And not at the same time, some other time, Bobby Kennedy volunteered. Well, Taylor, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said, this is interesting. They're all good men. So one morning, Bob McNamara came around and said, the president thinks it's funny you haven't volunteered. Well, I said, Bob, of course, if I can't back out of anything. If all the rest of his friends volunteer, I will too. Well, and then I got a call over and said, you're accepted. So then when you representative of the press came around after the announcement had been made, they'd come up to you, how did you get this job when over Rusk and McNamara and Bobby Kennedy and so on? What did you have they didn't have? I said, I had just one quality, expendability. That's got me that.
Well, to go back to my other question, what kind of instructions or what did Lyndon Johnson say to you as you were going out there? Did he give you any idea what he really wanted in Vietnam?
I can't say that he did in the sense that we sat down man to man because we'd been talking this for a year together at least. So that we knew each other's thoughts on. I didn't need any instructions really. Just two or three points of some minor interest. One is he insisted that I write him a letter.
I'm sorry, could you, when you say these three, could you mention Johnson's name?
Yeah, President Johnson asked me to send a personal letter to him once at the end of every week. A wire, a cable. Send it to him directly. Well, that became a major chore as Friday came around and said, what the hell's happened in the last week that I will tell the president? Cables go in, everything goes in, but his point was not a bad one. There's so much literature flows into the White House, into any major headquarters in Washington. The question of selecting out those important things is very, very important, and usually staff officers do that. It's a filtering out process to the president's door of successive layers of staff who say, well, he's not interested in this, maybe you ought to have that, and eventually he gets the cable. Well, to have the man on the ground who will say, I think the most important things in the last week were so-and-so, it has some values, but I was surprised and it's rather a chore, I must say. The other was an agreement I had with him, which I raised, that I'd like to have authority to come back to Washington at least every other month. I had seen how easy it was for Saigon, in spite of all the cables, to have these kinds of break of real understanding such as occurred in August of 63. And just to come back and mend fences in the government itself and also Congress to get the report. So I did that. I think 1 month I didn't make it, one date I didn't make because of a coup. But every time I came back, I had the satisfaction of talking directly to the president, all his advisors, and then going up onto the Hill and talking to the Congress. So that was a very valuable privilege to have, which I prize.
Still, to go back to this question again, even though you spoke to the president over a number of months and years, or even just, what was your general impression or feeling of what President Johnson's objective was in Vietnam?
Well, exactly what all his predecessors had been. He wanted to get the North Vietnamese off the back of South Vietnam and let the Vietnamese pick their own kind of government. Simple as that. No one ever took it that simply, but that was the core thought in every president that I dealt with on Vietnam, and that goes back to Eisenhower.
Since you mentioned the Tonkin Gulf resolution, can we go back and explore the incidents that led up to the Tonkin Gulf, to the activities? Now, I gather there was, it's been published, there was something called the 34A operations. Could you describe them, and what was our responsibility in those?
Well, the 34A operation was, again, a rather primitive, third-rate effort to do something to hurt the enemy in his own territory, just as I raised the point that was one of the ultimate reasons for our bombing program. And what our advisors helped the Navy, the very small Navy of South Vietnam, to take some patrol boat kind of vessels. They were in kind of a mixture, but general patrol boat type. Put on very simple weapons, such as just an ordinary infantry mortar, which you could put a base plate down and get it on the deck and use it. Machine guns, things of that sort, and then do such harassing operations as was possible up and down the coast. And this went on for several months. I don't recall exactly when it was started. It never had any real effect. I thought it made the Vietnamese who knew something about it, made them feel a little bit better, but it certainly was not any major operation, and I can't conceive of it ever being linked with the Tonkin Gulf, although I know that linkage has been attempted in the past, in recent times.
Well, what actually happened in the Tonkin Gulf incident?
Well, I wasn't there. I was in Saigon, and of course, I immediately was notified as ambassador that we had getting cables, intercepts. We weren't getting cables, we were getting intercepts of the traffic, the chatter going back and forth from the ships to other ships, and then from the ships back.
Excuse me.
Sorry, we just lost the light.
A light just went out.
Cameraman spoke too soon.
Gotta watch that.
Okay.
Okay, we've got speed now.
Okay, Stan.
General, what was the Tonkin incident?
Well, I'm a poor one to testify on the Tonkin Gulf because I was an ambassador in Saigon, very much interested, as everyone else was, with the intercepts that we received from the ships involved in the incident. As I recall, we had great difficulty understanding the cables, the intercepts, just as apparently the authorities in Washington did. But there was no doubt in my mind, what evidence I got, that there had been an attack on our ships. And my surprise was we didn't retaliate at once. We'd been discussing retaliation with bombing for some time out of Saigon for different purposes. And here apparently was an attack on the high seas on one or more of our naval ships. So that there seemed to be every reason to retaliate. It was convenient for one thing, and secondly, it was an offense for which retaliation was appropriate. So my only surprise was that they waited for a second one. Now, which ones was bona fide, if any, or were both of them bona fide? I know to this day, it seems to me, the evidence indicates that one clearly was and the other doubtful. But as it came to me in Saigon, there had been at least one attack, we assumed two attacks, and hence the retaliation that took place was quite understandable. Now then, the Tonkin Gulf resolution itself, as I read it, was an amazing thing, because I was very much surprised to find that everybody except two senators signed such a blank check, which it was. It went way beyond what I thought the importance of the mission was. So that was, to me, it was a surprising thing. But nonetheless, I took it very seriously as being a major endorsement of our policy.
Now, how did you regard the Tonkin Gulf resolution? Did you regard it as something useful as far as?
Well, it was. I didn't see it from that. I could, if I had put myself in the president's shoes, which I don't recall I did, I would see he had a gold mine, if you want to call it that, in terms of authorization from Congress. As ambassador, frankly, that point didn't occur to me. It did occur to me as being an indication of the depth and the strength of our policy, and that if I were thinking about recommending getting out of there, which I wasn't for the reasons I've already indicated, that I would certainly stop thinking about it right then.
Well, let me put it somewhat differently. Do you think that the war could have been prosecuted in a differently, and perhaps from your point of view in a better way, if there had been a straightforward declaration of war?
I didn't see it then. In post-war reflection on it, I would say that we should have declared war if we were going to carry this thing forward as we did. Now, having said that, I must say I sat in many debates listening to them among the State Department, discussing it with the President generally, and knew the arguments against a declaration of war, and they seemed to make reasonable sense. But having seen how, recognize now that the American people really won't take an undeclared war as imposing those restraints which we habitually have accepted in time of regular war. If indeed we're going to take up arms any place, we'd better do it formally, so they, and with complete concurrence of the representatives of the President and Congress, of the people in Congress.
What could you outline some of the pros and cons? What would have been the advantages of declaring war?
Well, as you see it now, the advantage is just what I indicated. There's no question about we are at war, and that justifies the military actions we're taking. It makes unquestionable the duty of a young man called upon to serve his country, It removes all the nebulous aspects of our involvement in Vietnam. On the other hand, the arguments against it was that whom do we declare war against? Well, we can't declare war against the Viet Cong. They don't exist as an entity in international society. If we declare war on Hanoi, well, then that raises the question: does that mean what effect would that have then on the Soviets and on China. Again, the linkage of mutual defense treaties. So, and then another argument that in case, when you have a formal war, you have to end it formally. You have to have a declaration of peace and negotiation. Many of us had the feeling, I did, and I think most of my colleagues, this thing is not something that's going to be that formalized. It's going to die down. It's going to be gradual suppression, and it'll go down, and it'll go out like a slow-burning fire. Whereas that termination would have been made more complicated if you had a formal war in existence at the time. So those were the general line of thought.
Apropos of that, who did you think we were really fighting in Vietnam? As you recall, many of the arguments put forth for going into Vietnam was that the real enemy was China, and we were there to deter the Chinese.
I never heard any official ever express that view. Ho Chi Minh was the man who was running that show up there, and we knew he was running it. And because of the fear of China, which I mentioned before, was generally accepted. The fact he was being a puppet of China didn't make any sense, and he wasn't a puppet of China.
Well, in fact, as you recall, Dean Rusk once said that we're there to prevent the Chinese from coming down into Southeast Asia.
I never heard that. I'm ashamed. I never heard him express that view. It was certainly not generally held by anybody. No.
On August 18th of 1964, according to the record, you sent a cable to Washington suggesting that we develop a pact. On August 18th, 1964, you cabled Washington suggesting that we develop a posture of maximum readiness for deliberate escalation of pressure against North Vietnam, starting using January 1st, 1965 as a target date. Now, at the same time, the president was running for election and was publicly saying that he was against a wider war. Did you see any inconsistency between your position and the president's?
I didn't have any feeling I was involved in the election. I was responsible to give him the best advice I could. That's what I sent. I was certainly aware of the fact when I recommended a retaliation for the attack on Bien Hoa Airfield, which I suppose you may be coming to later, that was just before the election, and to expect him to get an affirmative out of that was stretching my imagination, stretching my hopes at least.
In any case, you had a good deal of support in Washington for your recommendations in that cable of August 18th. Rusk, McNamara.
Well, this was just preparation, now you say. This was not doing it. Or you mean the cable you're referring to?
Yeah, and your recommendations were supported by a number of people in Washington.
I suspect so.
And Bill Bundy sent a memo to the president saying that the communists need to be shown that we and the South Vietnamese are not sitting back after the Tonkin Gulf incident. And it continued, the main further question is the extent to which we should add elements to the above actions, which was reprisal, that would tend deliberately to provoke a North Vietnamese reaction and consequent retaliation by us. In other words, a form of double escalation, if you want. Now, this memo has been interpreted afterwards as kind of an attempt by us to pick a deliberate fight with the North Vietnamese. How would you explain it?
I never saw that. You're telling me something I never heard about before, that particular Bundy memorandum. So I wouldn't...
you know, what about the gist of it? Does that seem to you to be reasonable?
The fact that he was commenting to the president on it, that he took an action of that, so to be normal in his case and his position, if that's what you mean.
Well, let me put the question differently then. Were we, in fact, trying to create conditions?
Not that I'm aware of. Not aware. We didn't have to. They gave us plenty of causes. As the record will show, I recommended at least twice bombing for Bien Hoa and for the Brink Barracks in Saigon, I believe one more before Pleiku came up when Bundy was on the ground, and retaliation by air was justified. So we had plenty of, maybe Mac didn't know it at the time he was going to get these opportunities. I don't know about this.
Yeah.
We didn't, but it never occurred to me you had to look to create a provocation, because they were provocative enough, and they will come around in due course.
Let me go back and ask you one question again. And there's been some analysis that consistent with your belief that in the dangers of putting American ground troops into Asia without some ability to strike at the sanctuaries, that in fact the trade-off was that your agreement, yours and the JCS agreement, was that you would only accept the introduction of American combat forces if North Vietnam was bombed. Is that fair?
No, that's complete nonsense. It just doesn't hold up on the logic thing. I was always, or after a certain point, really, when I found that the depth that we were in when I got there as ambassador, that we must use our air. The question was how, when, and under what circumstances. On the ground, I always had the feeling that they were ideally placed, as long as we had Marines over the horizon, off Da Nang, able to call it if an unexpected crisis came up in Da Nang or any place else. And I would like to have kept it that way. But as circumstances developed, that wasn't good enough, because the enemy was pressing harder all the time and put so much pressure in the north that I had to back away from that position.
I wonder if you could talk about your relations with Nguyen Khan, who was the prime minister, at least in your during your first few months as ambassador, and then successive prime ministers. You might mention how many.
Well, I'd have to get my own calendar out to be sure I didn't miss any. Khan was the first one, whom I had known as a brigadier general. Rather bright, obviously a bright number, but no one I'd ever picked to be in the front rank of the leadership. Yet after Big Min's coup that overthrew and resulted in the death of Diem and his brother, Min and his gang were just not bright enough to keep ahead of Khan, who was brighter than anybody. And pretty soon they found they were on the streets out of a job, and here was little, rather obscure Khan there. McNamara and I, as you pointed out, went over then to see Khan and look him over. And I don't know if we learned much more than we did before, except that he showed we talked to him about subjects which he would never discuss with him: matters of government, relations with the North, relations with the United States, future plans for military operations. And found he was indeed a very bright fellow who had been thinking about all these things. So our thought was, well, maybe this man might be the fellow for us. Well, again, our hopes were disappointed, because while Khan was bright, he had absolutely no character and was intriguing and maneuvering against everybody, including his best friend, and certainly against the Americans. And eventually he was thrown out with my enthusiasm, my quiet, I hope noiseless cheers by his own colleagues. And he was sent on his way with a few $1,000s in his pocket and told never to come back. So far as I know, he never has gone back. Well, then there were about three, there were really three others, or four others, until we ended with the key
Key and Tew.
Yeah, Tew. I'm trying to stumbling over the important man. General Tew and General Key combination, which then, with slight adjustments, carried on until the very disaster at the end. So that was a very hectic period. There were essentially 5 different governments I dealt with in 13 months.
Could you go back to Khan? There was a moment that I recall, there was quite a bust-up with Khan over a thing called the Vung Tau Charter when he tried to grab control of the government. Could you recall some of the...
Well, I can't give you two in detail. This was a charter he drew up himself, and without any real discussion with the Americans, and really imposed it, and it made his position particularly strong. We Americans, and we had the full documents and could study it, saw what he was up to, and didn't like it particularly. But I wouldn't say we didn't feel we could oppose it, because maybe this might give him the support he would require to make a go of his position. So I would say that was not a major issue. There's a case where we saw how he was always moving a little faster than anybody else and a little ahead of the procession, usually with something to assist Khan, and as a tip-off to his way of doing business, I would say. It was the overthrow of the Council of Elders which really created the great disturbance, because this was a gross violation of understandings they had with me, and that really led us to decide we can't use Khan and pass the word along to the generals. Whenever you're tired of Khan, we are too.
Again, we were getting deeper into Vietnam, and
When you're in the ship, you have to and your life's at stake. You have to pick the pilot, or at least you have a say in the pilot.
so then we were kind of getting into a situation where we had the responsibilities of being a colonial power with not all the advantages of being a colonial power.
That may be a good statement of it. I hadn't thought of it in those terms. Now, meanwhile, there was no question about our dedication to principle. We wanted to get out. Don't think we wanted to stay there, but we wanted to get this thing over with. And to get this thing over with, we had to have leadership, and we found none ready-made. So we had to have apprentice leaders, and we had to coddle them and protect them, hopefully until they could take over from themselves.
Did you have any shouting matches with Khan, or
Have what?
any shouting matches with Khan, or any real moments of confrontation with him?
Oh, well, I just told him very calmly that we had decided we could dispense with him, and he better make his plans on that basis. You never lose your temper with an Oriental, in my judgment. That shows lack of self-control and loss of faith.
As I recall, there was another incident where you got yourself into a confrontation with Key, as I recall. Am I correct about that? And some of the younger generals.
I think you may be. Yeah. Yes. You're thinking about this is the outcome at the time of Khan's decision to overthrow the Council of Elders. He wouldn't come to tell me himself what had happened. He sent 4 generals, including Chiu, Key, the Chief of Naval Operations, whose name I can't recall, and General T, as I recall, was the 4th one. And Alex Johnson and I both received, we had agreed and were really going to tell them in hard, cold terms what this meant. That this meant that they were rejecting the assistance, their ally, and their ally was just tired of it, and they could not count on our assistance if that's the way we were going to behave. Actually, it went off without any voice being raised, but then they went back and reported to Khan, and Khan's the one who showed great indignation that his officers had been treated so badly by the ambassador, and that's what the public noise was about.
There was at the time in Saigon somebody who, I gather, was keeping contact with a CIA man who was keeping contact with some of these people, with Conin, I guess.
Conin, that bum? Excuse me, take that off the record. He never had any authority with me whatsoever when I had him taken and sent home.
In other words, you didn't use him.
Never. I found he was getting his hand in, and then and say, "I'll help you. I will be your go-between." And I assured him I didn't need a go-between.
In other words, he was trying to move in.
He was trying to do something. I gather he had a relationship he had with the Lodge. I wasn't sure. That is my understanding.
Well, Lodge used him with the generals.
I think he took him. I believe Lodge took him back when Lodge went back as ambassador.
Oh, he wasn't there during your tenure as ambassador.
He was for a short while.
Yeah. Now, after the Bien Hoa...
Listen, I don't want that word bum to be put in there. You get that off.
Listen, I know Conin very well, and I've been calling him a bum for years.
I call a lot of people in a friendly way, but that's not a...
Well, let me go back to this point about the difficulty of... it might be worth making a point you made before, restating it. The difficulty of working through a surrogate government. I remember you mentioned when the lights were off, the problem with Dr. Quat, his reservations about troops being put in.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the idea that his own nationalist credibility might be undermined to some extent. Could you discuss that a little bit?
Well, this came up when in 65, when indeed the decisions in Washington had been made to start putting the Marines ashore at Da Nang. That was the first unit for which clearance was required. As ambassador, quite properly, I was told, go to the Prime Minister, who was Dr. Quat. Dr. Quat was a very fine, intelligent physician. He was a medical doctor. Had no political experience, but a very, very good man. But he was in very rough weather and very rough company as Prime Minister. But he was very conscientious, and he had never thought about this before. He was one of the numerous ones that had just come on the job. He had never thought about it, and his first reaction was somewhat as mine had been. Is this a good idea? That apart from what General Westmoreland says he needed the Marines, which was the prime reason for our decision, the white faces come to defend us. Aren't we going to? People aren't they going to think these are the French back? Is this maybe work against it? Well, I conceded that that was a possibility, and he was really the man to tell me that we Americans had thought of that, and we've been very slow in doing this, and hadn't decided to raise it, hadn't to offer these troops, except for the fact we are now convinced that Da Nang was in real danger. There was not enough strength in that area. The enemy was building up. Now we knew they had divisions, not just small units. That we could not feel that was safe, and he knew what it'd mean to the country if Da Nang suddenly fell in the hands of the enemy. Well, he said, let me reflect on it, and as I recall, it went overnight. And I went back, and he'd reflect on it and said, I agree. But I thought that was a very sensible reaction, considering this was apparently, I think, hitting for the first time, and it was an honest effort to think the thing through.
There's one thing that I think we laymen don't understand. We get into this question of preparation for bombing. At what stage was North Vietnam targeted? I mean, was it everything all prepared in advance?
I can't give you in detail, but the normal military way that long before anyone ever was really pressing on the decision on bombing, any prudent commander, the Air Force commander in South Vietnam, and certainly CINCPAC out in Honolulu, has looked over every possible target over there and has programmed them, and at least he put them down on maps and has tried to get as much information as he can so he'd be ready to accept them as targets. I didn't see that happen, but I'm sure it did.
After the Bien Hoa attack on November 1st, you remember you recommended reprisal bombing, and President Johnson replied asking if you wanted to assign ground troops
That surprised me.
to defend bases.
Yeah.
What was your reaction? Could you repeat that?
I
What
was
your
very
reaction?
much surprised when the
Sorry,
president.
can you start again?
When I recommended a retaliatory airstrike for the bombing of Bien Hoa Air Base, which was occupied largely by American aircraft, and the losses in personnel were all American. This was the first time the enemy had ever attacked a major military installation of the Americans. There was a change of tactics. It shouldn't be shrugged off, I thought, as just another thing instead of the war. It was something new, and it was an excellent reason to have a retaliatory strike. Well, unfortunately, it was the day before election, and that was turned down. As you mentioned, the president's cable in declining then asked would I be interested in, I think it was troops to guard air bases, which was a large factor. In other words, it was more related to the Bien Hoa in the sense that it proposed using American troops for this purpose. Well, I was very much surprised because it seemed to me so much more difficult to offer American troops to come in to take over that task than it was what I had been turned down on for doing. That I was very much surprised. But it tipped off something to me that the name of the president was further down the road in his thinking with regard to the use of American ground forces than I was.
In other words, he was campaigning on one platform when thinking about something
Oh,
else.
I'm sure he was. Sure he was. But he's bound to have been thinking about these things. It should have been. It had been not only inefficiency, inadequacy as a leader, not to be thinking about it for a long time. And I suppose it's not entirely inconsistent to say, as a politician, as of today, I have no plans to bring in American troops.
You were back in Washington in late November, November 27th, and feeling rather gloomy about the future of Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And there seemed to be a little bit of a sort of change here. Earlier, the consensus in Washington had been that you need a stable government in Saigon as a precondition for bombing.
Yeah.
And later, the attitude was the weakness of the government in Saigon was a reason for the bombing. What was the change here?
Well, this was the first of the Washington manufactured thesis, that you can't bomb unless your government's stable. I never understood that. I said yes, sir, when the President said that, or the Secretary of State, but I never believed it. However, it was I certainly agreed it was highly desirable to get a stable government regardless of why you're doing it. So it was not a major issue. But when you saw that you were not getting stable, the morale of the country was going down, the strength of the enemy was building up, and still you had an unused weapon of great potential value, and not to use it was complete nonsense. And so I simply was voicing for the first time an objection to a slogan, if you want to call it, that had been used to hold down those who were keen or enthusiastic for the use of the air power.
Sam, excuse me one moment. Would you reach forward and tuck the mic, the general's mic cable under his jacket?
Uh-huh.
It slipped out somehow.
All right.
All right.
Thank you.
After your meeting with Johnson in November of '64, there was a memo to him recommending a gradual bombing campaign aimed at persuading North Vietnam to reduce its support for the Viet Cong. Curiously, Lyndon Johnson decided to consult our allies rather than consult Congress on this. Do you think it was a mistake not for him not to have gone to Congress about bombing, or do you think?
Well, certainly at that stage, there was no reason to. This was a recommendation of a program which might or might not be implemented. I'm not sure. As I recall, I don't think there's any particular reason on that particular point in time they should. But certainly before he decided to embark on this, he should have talked to the leadership. I was always surprised that the President, with his great reputation for political savoir-faire, turned out do things that even a simple soldier would think is mishandling your Congress.
In January '65, you were asked if you wanted ground troops. I think there was a State Department request. But, at any rate, your reply, according to the record, was that ground troops might make the South Vietnamese slacken their efforts.
Yes, I remember my reply, but I don't remember what triggered the cable. There's no question. Yes, there's no question about my opinion was let's not bring them any ground forces in until we have to. And as of January, I didn't think we had to.
Was it because you felt that they would slacken their efforts if we did?
That is, that they might slacken their efforts. They might take the French. This might work against us. But most important of all is I thought once you get into this business, how do you turn back? Now, there was no one was blind about the danger of that first soldier, Marine, coming ashore. I certainly wasn't. And it was that aspect that you'll find, I think the cable show, that once the decision was made, the Marines decided coming ashore. As far as I was concerned, that's that. Let's go, boys, as fast as we can receive these troops logistically and have a real mission for them. But up until that first Marine went ashore, I was against it until it was proved necessary.
Well, in early 1965, when you were asked if you wanted ground troops and you said not yet, I wonder if you could go back over this point about saying that it might prompt the South Vietnamese to slacken their efforts.
Well, I think, as I recall, I listed that as one of the objections as a possible development.
Could you repeat the point?
That in answering to the cable with regard to the need for introducing American ground forces. I had other reasons for opposing it at the time, but that was all had frequently been raised in our previous discussions in Washington and Saigon, the impact on the Vietnamese. Would they then slacken in their efforts and let us take over the task? I thought it was a valid point, although it's certainly I'm not sure that that was ever the case after we came in.
There is a report that there was a CIA study that was done saying that the North Vietnamese had the capacity to escalate in response to a bombing campaign of the North, and that this was eliminated from a mission report that you sent back to Washington in early 1965. Was that true? Was the CIA?
I know of no such thing. Actually, everybody said it. I don't know why anyone would take it out unless it's just because it was a known fact. In fact, I don't ever know of any intelligence report ever sent out by the CIA that ever came to my attention that go through exactly as it was. If I didn't agree with it, I sent a separate cable. And I don't recall I ever did that.
Could you describe the Pleiku, the attack on Pleiku? You were there at the time. I mean, in Saigon.
I was in Saigon.
I just want to ask one point about this. Was the Pleiku attack, I mean, there had been various other attacks. There was the Bien Hoa attack. There was the Brinks BOQ on Christmas Eve. I mean,
And Queen Yan was a third, and then I believe Pleiku was a fourth.
well, was this really the trigger to start the bombing of the North?
Well, each time I recommended retaliation, and up until Pleiku it was turned down. Now, it just happened that McGeorge Bundy was visiting in Saigon, the first time I'd ever been in Saigon, and which I welcomed because of his position in the White House, and it was a great strengthening of the understanding to have him see with his own eyes what was going on. And he had once, I told him I'm sending in this cable for recommending bombing, and he volunteered, as I recall, to telephone in and his support. We each talked to Cy Vance, I believe, by telephone on the subject. I asked him for his approval, and to my amazement, Cy Vance telephoned back, in a very short time, I would say 15 to 20 minutes, maybe somewhat longer, giving us a concurrence that I had been trying to get for months.
I wonder if, to go back about to your earlier requests, if you recall this, I mean, I obviously don't want you to say it if you don't, but in the Bien Hoa attack occurred the night before the elections, and it's been said that one of the reasons Lyndon Johnson didn't want to start the bombing is it was a bad thing to do the night of the elections. The Brinks BOQ happened on Christmas Eve,
Yeah.
and you don't bomb on Christmas.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, does this ring true with you?
Yes, very much so,
I
and
wonder
very
if
much
you
is
could
in my mind, I can assure you.
Wasn't there something on Thanksgiving too, which?
Queen Yan was the next one, and I don't recall any reason there. There might have been, but I've forgotten.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but could you go through that scenario of the eve of election or Christmas Eve?
Well, it just happened that Bien Hoa, which was significant, as I mentioned, I think before, as being the very first time that an American installation had been attacked directly by the Viet Cong. We had soldiers killed, yes, but usually they'd been mingled with South Vietnamese. Hence my recommendation. I knew that November 4th followed November 3rd, but nonetheless, from the point of view of the situation in Vietnam, we should have retaliation. I must admit I was not surprised when I was turned down. Then there were two others. One was in the Brink officer barracks in Saigon, which took place on Christmas Eve. Again, recommended retaliation, got turned down. I felt reasonably sure, who wants to bomb Santa Claus? Queen Yan, I can't recall. I can't recall why it was turned down. It was not spectacular, but again, it was a building blown up with some slight loss of life. Pleiku came along then in the following year, and there was no critical date nearby. I think they claimed it in Washington. Perhaps it changed somewhat, and it was proved very promptly.
Now, there was one thing about the bombing in the North after the Pleiku attack. Kosygin was in Hanoi at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Did that give you any cause for pause that this
It
was
didn't
not
me
good?
because I'm not sure that I knew it. At least it was never a matter for discussion. Again, this was Saigon. From Saigon's point of view, this is the thing to do. If Kosygin's in the North, they better know about it in Washington.
According to I may be coming back over a point we mentioned earlier, but according to the stuff in the Pentagon Papers, you had some reservations about Westmoreland's recommendation in February '65 about putting Marines into the Da Nang to secure the Da Nang base. That this was a kind of opening the wedge, as you said earlier.
Well, of course, General Westmoreland and I were very close all the time in Vietnam. We confided. He knew everything of importance that I knew, and I would assume I'm sure I knew everything of importance that he was doing that was at what I would call policy level. I had a very unusual authority when I became ambassador, one which I would never recommend being repeated. I was by the president. The president wanted me to be in charge of everything that went on in South Vietnam, and I said that include the military operations, everything. So that's the way my directive was written. I knew this would make my military friends unhappy, so I went first to General Wheeler, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Went over it, said that's what it is. That's the way the president wants it. I know you won't like it. You can tell him so if you want to, but that's the way he wants it. It's going to be written. I hope you won't worry about it because, you know, as a military man, I think I know enough to keep my finger out of military pies, and we'll try to do so. Did the same thing with Admiral Sharp, Sinkback, and then with Westmoreland. Showed him the paper, read the letter. And Westy and I very quickly said this is no problem because I told Westy, I want to see every cable you send to the Pentagon, which is at a policy level. And if I hope you'll discuss it with me in advance. But if you want to send it, obviously you're right and duty to send it. I will then send my own cable to the president via the channel. I think in one case we disagreed, and I still can't remember what it was. It was not too big, but nonetheless, this happened only once. So I knew very well Westy's concern about the North and generally the Da Nang area. So I was not at all surprised when he finally gave a formal recommendation. I believe that's what you're talking about in February. I was still not convinced that it was necessary. We had 3 battalions of Marines just over the hill. I couldn't believe that 3 battalions of Marines couldn't hold off any number of the Viet Cong, even reinforced, against Da Nang at that time. But then fairly shortly after that, additional evidence came in of major units in the North. And I think it was that time Westy came back and I supported his request. I'm not quite sure of that sequence, but that's about the way it worked out.
You remember the Honolulu conference took place in April.
Yeah.
And again, according to the documents in the Pentagon Papers, at least partly called in response to your rather negative reaction to the notion of putting in ground forces. Was that whole issue debated at Honolulu?
As I recall, that in about April 2nd, I was back in Washington to discuss this question of where are we going now. My recollection again is by that time the Marines were ashore and 1 airborne brigade was authorized and perhaps to come to the Saigon area. The question was, what after that? I met with the president and all his advisors and thought there was an agreed list. I was not pressing any particular number of forces as long as Westmoreland could say he could accommodate them. But the actual decision was quite a limited number. Again, I'm sorry, I can't give the note. That would go in. So I took off back for Honolulu, for Saigon, thinking I understood what the future held. I'd hardly got there till cables started coming in from all copies of cables, military cables, alerting this unit, this Marine unit, this regiment, Army units being alerted. And I was terribly, what is going on here? What's happened? Somebody suddenly pulled the plug, so to speak, and all these units are coming without my being informed, and I was really hot under the collar and sent quite a warm cable back to Washington on the subject, which resulted in a stop everything order to everybody had been alerted to meet in Honolulu, and that came up, and that's where we sat down and agreed on a troop list, which is the one they actually followed.
Now, again, from the outside, having been at Honolulu, it seems that when everybody met at Honolulu, one was able to foresee how many troops would have to be committed to Vietnam over the long term. Is that true? I mean,
Well, it was an estimate to say we don't. No one ever said this is all you're going to need, but said we know we need this many over the next 3 months. Westmoreland says he can accommodate them. We have the troops in the United States. We'll approve that list.
but there were no real numbers put on how many you would have over the long term.
Never. No one ever. I never heard anyone ever undertake to say how many will you need in the end. You see, it was almost unpredictable, even if you had to do it over again, because the enemy really controlled the initiative. We could send enough in to stop what was there, and had no one else come across the frontier, to establish a reasonable amount of order. But the other side wasn't in that mood. He didn't understand the rules of the game. He kept reinforcing.
Do you recall how many troops were going to be in by the end of '65?
No, but of course the record's there. I've forgotten how.
Yeah.
The final number was around half million, something like that.
Final number, yeah, but
Yeah.
by the end of '65.
No. It was all phased. There was no, from that point on, there was no question about the ambassador knowing what was taking place and approving of it.
Were you in the embassy in March? At the end of March, there was an attack on the embassy.
I showed the very good judgment to be away at that time. I was here in Washington, and get Alex Johnson, who was my very able State Department representative, my number 2, managed to get a war scar out of it, and we lost one employee killed and many wounded. I have the picture of Lyndon Johnson in one of these rooms that has which was the picture behind my desk when I was away, which has the chinks in it made by flying glass, which would have gone through the ambassador had he been sitting there.
By the end of the spring of '65, as I recall, almost all of the South Vietnamese strategic reserve battalions had been chewed up in various battles, Phuc Long, Quang Nai, and so forth. And was this the thing that turned your view towards the need for American troops?
It was the whole composite situation, which was the losses of the units in South Vietnam, the lack of battle worthiness of a large number of their battalions, the evidence of larger units moving across into the north, and all that, and edging up toward Da Nang. So there were many indicators by that time that I had no compunctions whatsoever to agree, after having been opposed originally, to the landing of the Marines.
During that period of '65, we began to hear all these new phrases that were coming out, like the enclave theory and the search and destroy approach and so forth. What did these things mean? They became a part of our language.
They seemed to mean other things, different things to different people. Somebody said I was for the enclave theory, which I think Jim Gavin really fathered. From Jim's point of view, as I understood it, I think he said I don't understand it, but his editor understood it as I did. That we'd put our troops in areas along the beach, along the front, and just leave them there. They'd be there as a potential threat, and by some device I never quite understood, that would be a deterrent to further reinforcement. Well, that was one enclave theory. I think I was accused of saying essentially the same things, because I wanted and actually had the initial troops come in and go into areas on the coast with the idea they would get all their equipment together, get set, clear out their own area, so there's no question of having raids into their own camps, and then be ready to work in general reserve, whatever task Westmoreland decided to give them.
What did you think of what was search and destroy?
Search and destroy was nothing more than what, as you start in your military education, say at the infantry school, you learn that the battle consists of reconnaissance, of fixing the enemy, of fighting the enemy, and destroying the enemy. Well, search and destroy was to find the enemy and then to destroy the enemy. So it was just a compressed phrase of the purpose of all ground operations. It ended up by suggesting that you're out really to destroy the country which you were trying to save. At least that seemed to have been the interpretation. I was a little like the word counterinsurgency, a very unhappy choice of words which could be turned against the user.
Did you feel during this whole period of revolving door governments that during the time you were ambassador, that there might be a government that might come in that would favor a neutralist solution for South Vietnam?
Not really, because at least insofar as I knew these Vietnamese, and I knew them by that time at least a long time and lots of hours and discussions and with them and working with them. They had such a stake in this place that they knew what a neutralist government meant. It meant an eventually communist takeover, the old communist formula. They knew it very well. They knew their lives were at stake, their country was at stake, and so on. So I had no real concern about that. I knew there was a small neutralist group, unidentified, in the country, but how large it was, I never knew, and it never seemed to be of any importance. All the generals talking about themselves always accused those French-trained generals of being necessarily neutralist because France was neutralist, which was a logic I don't think you necessarily follow.
What was it like to deal with Key after he became prime minister?
Well, Key was an interesting character. I often said he was the Vietnamese Georgie Patton. He had much of his flamboyance, had the same pearl pistols, he had the same flaring foulard around his neck, and he's a very gallant man. If he wanted a bomb put on the right place, he looked like Kurt LeMay. I would like to have Key or Kurt LeMay take that bomb and put it down. They were the kind of people who did it. Having said that, he had no sense of organization, whatever. He's an idea man. He came into office and announced a list far greater promises than any president ever came in. And he had this foggiest idea what it really meant and how he'd get the resources and so on. I understand he protests now that we Americans wouldn't let him do all these things. Well, he never knew what he wanted to do to start with, and they never had the means. So I just say he was a good man to have around, but he had his limitations. And the Key team made a better combination than I ever expected when we first put them together.
Under what circumstances did Lodge come back and replace you? Was this a change in
Well,
policy?
I had not wanted to go to Vietnam. I hadn't wanted to come back to public service, and I'd come back, as I told President Kennedy, in military capacity because I couldn't deny an obligation to serve in there. And I took this job as ambassador, knowing what I was getting to do. I had no idea. I had a pretty clear idea of what it was.
Oh.
Excuse me. I guess we had a sound problem. A motorcycle went by. Can you ask that question again, Stan?
Yeah.
About Lodge.
Under what circumstances did Lodge come back and replace you?
Yeah. Sorry, it was just the noise outside. What were the circumstances of Lodge's return to replace you as ambassador?
Well, I had not wanted to go to Vietnam. I felt there were plenty of good State Department professional ambassadors to go out and do this job, but did it because the president really seemed to feel he really was in a situation he had to solve. Someone had to go out there. But I did it with the understanding I only spent a year. Well, actually, I spent a little over that, not much, but it was always understood that I would come back at that time. When Lodge came back, I was frankly surprised, simply because he'd been there. He knew there was no sign of cure either. The fact that he put himself in double jeopardy, I told him, ought to get him 2 decorations instead of just 1. So that was all it amounted to. My tour was up, and as I approached it, I started to remind him, bear in mind we have a deal here that roughly a year I'll be coming back. And in due course, Lodge was nominated.
There's a recollection of my own that in '65, when we began to put troops in, the objective was we were going to try to stop the communists from cutting the country in 2, if I recall, trying to stop the communists from coming down to divide.
That was mentioned as one of the possibilities. I don't know that was the reason that was justified. It was just the strength of the enemy who could have done a lot of things and did a lot of things.
But I remember that at the end of 1965, there was a visit to Saigon by McNamara.
What year was it? When was this?
End of '65.
End of 65.
Yeah. And the language that began to come out of the mission was somewhat different. It was we were going to go on and win the war. It seemed to change from we're going to stop the other side.
Was it my embassy or was this Elijah's embassy by that time?
Well, was it at the end of '65? It might have been your embassy.
It might have been either one of it. At the end of '65. No, I have an alibi. I left in July of '65.
Well, let me ask you in a general way. Do you think it's valid or a mistake to begin with one kind of objective and change your objective in a sense.
No, of course we did that in Korea, and that cost us a difficult.
I was thinking of the
No,
Korean.
I never knew that was. I never saw this trend you talked about. I watched this as I came back. The president asked me to be his consultant. I told him I had already signed a contract to run the Institute for Defense Analyses, and that was a full-time job. He said, "Well, give me just half your time." Well, it's awful hard to turn a president down when has some need, and so I signed up. But I didn't know one thing. That he was to get the daylight hours, and I was to get the hours of darkness. So I spent many hours over there, over cables, and I was close to it. I would have known this had there been any conscious change in policy, and I never heard this, to tell you the truth.
What do you think?
And to say win is not a dirty word. Depends on what you mean by. Oh, I'm glad you mentioned this because I had to argue. See, I was fighting doves and hawks at all times. My hawks, being my best friends, they were sometimes the hardest. They say, "Why don't you get out there and win this thing?" They say, "Well, what do you mean by winning?" Well, that makes them gulp and swallow their Adam's apple. Are you talking about an Appomattox or a surrender on the deck of the Missouri, or what are we talking about? And they didn't know. I said, "I'll tell you what winning is. It's doing what you set out to do, and we're going to win that if we don't give up. Setting out to do is self-determination for South Vietnam and the end of the attack from the north." And in that sense, I would hope that was always the objective. It should have been.
In your opinion, did congressional criticism later begin to interfere with the management of the war? Do you think we were fighting on two fronts, one later, in the later period?
Well, you mean while I was there, or
no,
later?
later.
Well, it's unhappily true, and that's one of the reasons why I would say I regret we didn't declare war, that many honorable members of Congress got up and made statements were of great value to the enemy, giving aid and support to the enemy by any interpretation you possibly could. And that's most regrettable. Certainly that made it very difficult for the conduct of the war.
Would you single out any of these people?
Nope. The record's clear. You can find them, as you know very well.
Yeah, but I want to hear them from your
I know.
ruby red lips.
I'm not doing this, to get any private vengeances off. I hope we're contributing to some clarification of what happened out there, which is terribly fogged up in the minds of people and the minds of history.
What were your relations with the press, and what kind of a
While I was there, I would say it was not brilliant, but it was good. It was satisfactory. Barry Zorthian came out to help me. Who was I thought one of the best public relations men I ever met. I tried to be as frank with I met regularly with the press. I enjoyed talking to them. I knew several of them were very much against what I was doing, but that's their privilege. No, I couldn't complain. The real problem came when the troops came in, and I suppose had the good fortune not to face that problem. What are you going to do when you have a war and you don't have any censorship? You don't have the kind of handling of the press which has been traditional in the wars of this century, at least.
Well, there are some members of the press who really would have preferred to have censorship.
I've heard them say that. And I wondered if they really meant it. Now, why wasn't it put in? While I had nothing to say about it, I was certainly interested in it and analyzed the pros and cons. The problem was who's going to. That means censorship. It means putting out passes. It means restriction of movement. Well, the latter two we could certainly handle. There's no reason why we couldn't say that any press representative who's going out with the troops has to have a card certifying him and accepts the fact he will do what the responsible area commanders will put in. But if you're talking about censorship, are you going to have the MAG running a censorship, the embassy run a censorship? Anybody had wanted to conduct the censorship by running up to Hong Kong. It was almost impossible to control in any traditional sense, the way they ran World War II, for example. Or are you going to turn it over to the Vietnamese government? Well, we knew how terribly inept they were, how they infuriated their best friend, and so forth. So it was just a tough one that no one ever had a solution for. I hope you'll develop this point when you...
Yeah, we're going to try and do one show on the press. Another observation has been made about the American experience, in a sense, is that we lacked an institutional memory. Now, there are a couple of points that you made. One is the rotation system was such that people left.
Yeah.
The other one is, of course... Oh, I'm sorry. It's your wife coming in.
Hey, Miss.
The sense that we were there without any real memory. First, because of the rotation of people was such that, as you say, you had to invent the wheel every time you came out. The other thing is that we didn't really, this has been a charge, that we really didn't learn anything from the French experience in Indochina. What do you think about this?
Well, I agree to some extent and disagree with that to other extent. There was certainly an undesirable rotation in the military of replacement. But we had the same thing in Korea. We should not have been surprised, nor I think were we surprised, with the objectionable features to replacement. But what was the alternative? Are you going to freeze a man, or are you going to take that regular army that we had and take them out there and leave them there until they die off or they run out of enlistments and come back and no one ever will join the army again for the next 10 years? Or are you going to then draft people and send them out there for 4 or 5 years or something like that, or some long period of time? The alternatives were just as bad as replacement. We knew you could live with replacement, but it certainly lowered the efficiency of units. So an outfit has never trained you. You're always training new men coming in. Now, in Korea, there's one thing, though, which I mentioned. In Korea, we had the good judgment to have what we call katusas. Katusas were Korean soldiers who were assigned to American units. They're all infantrymen. And they're a great privilege to be assigned to American units, because then you got on American rations and all various things of that sort. And those lads, there'd be, say, 2 or 3 in a squad. Well, they were until they got killed off, if they did. If they didn't, they were the hardcore of that squad. They were the repository. The English wasn't very good, but they knew all the tricks of the trade. And the recruits came in. They were a great help to the officers and the non-commissioned officers. We were never wise enough to do that in South Vietnam. I suggested it several times to my Pentagon friends after I came back. They had a dozen good reasons why not to do it. I didn't think they were very good, don't think they're very good still. But that would help a little bit. Now, the other aspect
was that we did learn very much from the French experience.
I would say that we knew the French experience. See, we had mags there while the French were there, so we had some of our senior officers went back there, had the French experience. But the French experience was not good. We knew it was bad, and much of it we shouldn't follow. They believed in the Beaugest forts as we sat around and sitting there and doing just what we found the South Vietnamese army to do. And we were fairly sure that you'll never end this thing unless you get out and run the enemy down and run them out of the country or dispose of them one way or another. So I don't know that we missed very much there. Now, I thought you might have added, how about the British experience down in Malaysia? I was very much interested in that. I'd visited Malaysia before going out there. And also I knew Thompson, William Thompson, you probably know.
Robert Thompson.
Robert Thompson. He was very useful. And I think he writes now as rather reproachfully, we didn't follow that example. I would say we learned a lot from him on some things, but that war was so completely different. It was a criminal affair. When I visited Malaysia, they had pictures on the wall of the principal guerrillas. It was the principal wanted men of the FBI. And furthermore, they were chasing, generally speaking, Chinese who stood out. They had all great simplicity in their task. So we learned something, I would say, from both. I hope we learned as much as we should. But we didn't. Our failures were not due to not following the French example.
What you now see people in the armed forces. What impact has the Vietnam War made on the American armed forces today?
Well, that's too big a question. I just don't know. I would say, of course, most of them would like to forget about it because it's a very bitter experience, and the treatment they received here at home, it's not just the veterans here that were not out of jobs, the whole feeling that the armed forces fought the dirtiest, hardest war, the ones that are out there. I often told my son, my company commander, he went through more in the 9 months he had that company. I went in 3 wars in terms of real hardships, real exposure, and no appreciation for that. In fact, condemnation. Well, they don't bellyache, they don't speak out loud, but they feel that very deeply, or have. I think it's tending to go away. But it takes the other unhappy form of saying, well, let's forget about that kind of war, and let's think about Europe and those good old days of World War II, divisions and corps and tanks and so on, which is something that is part of the military profession, but it's far from all, as I see, problems that are ahead of us.
You'd be happy to know I'm about to make the last question.
Are you sure? Well,
Yeah.
the tape must be sagging a little bit.
Well, it's a very general one again. What would you say are the lessons of Vietnam? What can we learn from Vietnam?
Well, tremendous list. Of course, if you ask the lessons in diplomacy, the lessons in military tactics, in logistics, in economics played a very important part in the war. Enormous things for applicable to that unusual situation. The real problem, I see the military problem more clearly than the other, is to sort out what is peculiar and not transportable out of this situation, to avoid saying, well, because this succeeded or failed in Vietnam, it'll succeed or fail someplace else. The selectivity with which these lessons are first recognized and then exploited is very important to every branch of the government.
Well, let's make it personal. What would you say is, to you, the most important lesson out of Vietnam?
Well, I wish you'd put it this way. What are our principal failures? Because I can answer that with great
All right.
confidence. I would say it's in the intelligence field. Now, that doesn't mean the CIA is no good or G2s aren't any good. I mean in the sense that as a government, that we knew far too little about first our ally. We're going to help this little country. No one ever told us we're going to have no leaders to work with. No one had told us that that there was no unity in the country, no sense of nationhood. There was none of that cement that held Korea together. I was always thinking, well, this must be about like Korea. Well, Korea, you had a unified country. You had a old President Rui, who wasn't George Washington, but he was a strong, stalwart type that you could lean on and get support from. You found none of that down there. Well, that was a surprise to everybody, as far as I know. At least no bright, wise guys, even after the fact, have said we understood the Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese. Well, next we knew even less about North Vietnam. I was always asking, well, who really knows Ho Chi Minh? Well, a few people in Washington had met Ho Chi Minh, but in terms of what kind of man he was, nobody really knew. And then from that way on down, they never heard of most of them. So we never had, and almost nobody had spent any real time in North Vietnam. So the information directly from sources, reliable sources, on most of the rather rudimentary things was lacking. But the final thing, we didn't know ourselves. We hadn't followed the Delphic orator, know thyself. We didn't know ourselves. I thought this was the same country that fought the Korean War. It wasn't. It was a different country. And the events that happened here at home were incredible. I couldn't understand it. In Vietnam, I just started when I came home. And when I got here, I couldn't understand what had happened. And I hadn't been out of this country a long period of time. So we didn't know ourselves. So until we know the enemy, know our allies, know our friends, and then know ourselves, we better keep out of this dirty business. It's very dangerous.
It's terrific. Listen, I just thought of one last question, if I may, because we may do one show on Cambodia. And just, I know you weren't involved at the time, but from a purely sort of military point of view, did you think the incursion into Cambodia in 1970 was a useful operation?
Yes, it should have been done before. There is every reason to go out and clean up the areas just over the line where large collections of military supplies being used against us the next day. Every reason to do it. We talked about it before that I was against it. I was never against it because it shouldn't be done. But I'd ask my Vietnamese friends who were all so keen, blood in their eye, that comes and let us get over and we'll clean them up. You'll just you'll get something the first day, then they'll be gone and be going to the next jungle, over the next jungle. And you haven't cleaned up the jungles here in your own country. So it is that the impossibility with the means available that made me very much against going into Cambodia on the ground. But when Nixon went in with the air he had and under the circumstances, I thought he was absolutely right. Now, I wouldn't say he handled it either publicly or with Congress the right way, but as a responsible action, the head of state, I would say he was right.
Except we had a new war on our hands, didn't we, as a result?
No, well, hell, we had that same war all the time. It never failed. Cambodia was at war with us by any sense. By every day they let the enemy operate outside of there. That had been going on for years.
Well, that's great. I think that's, unless anybody's got any more, listen.
Well, if anybody's got anything more, just hold it to his or herself.
I was just If you just repeat that last statement about that we were already, because the Stan caught from that.
We were already, what was that?
The last statement, you said we were already in that war.
Stan said
Oh.
except we had a new war on our hands.
Uh-huh.
Oh, I see. We said we have a new war. in
Yes,
our-
I'm not sure that I'll get the same eloquence into this.
I'm sure.
Go ahead.
You want to ask the question?
Yeah, I'll ask the question. I'll even be provocative. I mean, we found ourselves now supporting another government, the Lon Nol government, after that incursion, and we had a new war on our hands, didn't we?
No, I wouldn't. I would say that by any interpretation of war, we've been at war with Hanoi from the very with Cambodia since at the outset, since the territory of that country is being used for military operations, the formation of military attacks, and the stationing of indispensable supplies on Cambodian soil. We should have gone over there long before if we'd had the resources to do so. So I would say that we didn't start a new war. The war was already there. What we did in relation to the Phnom Penh government, I'm not sure about. That was the political aspect, but we never took on any obligation there except to stop something which was greatly impeding the termination of the war that we were trying to end.
That's fine.